Notre Dame robbed of a playoff spot, who the committee should have put in, as well as who I would put in my ideal playoff system. Now, look, the top 8 are pretty solidified. I don't think anyone's debating. Maybe if you're an Ole Miss hater, you could say because they lost their coach, they should be kicked out. I think that's a bit of a stretch and kind of ridiculous. Oklahoma at 10-2. Maybe if Texas was 10-2, we could consider Texas being up in here. But look, I think Oklahoma's got some solid wins, especially over Alabama. I think Oklahoma's got to be in. So the real debate is the 9, the 10 slot. Because although it's a 12-team playoff, we have to take the 5 highest champions, which includes Tulane, which includes James Madison. So it's really just, are you in the top 10, you get a playoff spot. And we've got a few contenders. The people are always debating Alabama, Miami, Notre Dame. I think we also have to factor in BYU. Because BYU, look, they had 1 loss in the regular season. If we're not going to hurt Miami or Alabama for getting blown out in their SEC championship, how are we going to hurt BYU? BYU moves down 1 slot for losing. Ohio State moves down 1 slot for losing. And Ohio State's more understandable because they lost the team behind them, and that team is undefeated. So that one makes sense. But how can BYU move below Notre Dame and Miami when Miami and Notre Dame didn't get a win? If we're going to go with the argument that you can't be doxxed or, dropped at all for losing a championship, I understand that. I'm not sure if I agree, but I understand that. But how is it randomly applied? BYU can move below teams that didn't play. Ohio State can move down, which I kind of get. But Alabama doesn't move down at all, especially in a very contested playoff race. And then you got to factor in Texas as well. Look, if they had 2 losses, I think they would definitely be in. But they've got some big wins. They've got some big wins. They beat Texas A&M, and Texas would be a hot team. But it's really, at the end of the day, it's Alabama, Miami, Notre Dame is the 3 teams we're debating. And I gotta admit, the resumes are pretty similar. Alabama beat Georgia, so Alabama out of those 3 have the best win. Now, they do have 3 losses, but the third loss doesn't fully count because, number 1, they already beat Georgia. But number 2, it was an SEC championship, so they could have sat out and still been 10-2. So I think you got to keep Alabama in. It's weird because they do have 3 losses, but they have the best win. They play in the harder conference. They've got the harder overall schedule. So it's really between Miami and Notre Dame. And it is kind of absurd how the committee had Notre Dame ranked higher than Miami the entire season. And then neither of them had a game left. Notre Dame was ranked over Miami. And then, boom, now all of a sudden head-to-head matters. I mean, it's completely ridiculous. Look, if you had a 10-2 Bama, 10-2 Miami, well, you have 10-2 Oklahoma, 10-2 Alabama, 10-2 Miami, 10-2 Notre Dame, and you're trying to rank those, I think it's pretty obvious, because all of these teams are pretty similar, that Miami has to be over Notre Dame and Oklahoma has to be over Alabama. Now, that does get into a discussion, because do you have Oklahoma at 8, Miami at 9, and then we fight Alabama versus Notre Dame? Is it Miami at 8, Oklahoma at 9? But all I know is if these 4 teams are being compared to each other, Oklahoma beat Alabama, Miami beat Notre Dame. So all I know is Miami and Oklahoma, if there's only 2 spots left, and there's 3, but if there's only 2 spots left, and they all have the same amount of losses, I think you'd have to put Oklahoma and Miami in. But regardless, we've got 3 spots. So I think it's obvious Oklahoma gets in. I think it's obvious Miami gets in. And if we're just looking at Alabama versus Notre Dame, I think Alabama's got a better resume. But if it is coming down to Miami versus Notre Dame, Miami's got the win over Notre Dame, obviously. Notre Dame has the win over USC. Both have had pretty easy schedules. Obviously being an independent and being an ACC team, don't really have any tough matchups. You both have 2 losses, which we shouldn't even really be considering you with those cupcake schedules. I just think, they played, and you have to honor that. We can look at all these analytics, but at the end of the day, even if you think Notre Dame's better, even if you think they'd win 7 out of 10 games, unfortunately, one of the games the only game that matters is the game Miami won. And even if that means if they play again, Notre Dame wins, what are we going to base this off of? Are we just going to base this off of the eye test? I think Notre Dame's great. It's like I don't really know if that's a good way to go about things. So I honestly, I think they got it right. I really do think they got it right. Now I'd probably have Texas A&M over Ole Miss. But other than that, I think it's pretty fun. You could say Georgia over Ohio State. That's debatable, but I think overall they got it right. The process was absurd, though. Now, in terms of what I would do, if it's my magical playoffs, what I would do. So I probably would, in this year, if we could modify it, I would have an 8-team playoff. I think there's a top 7. We can see Indiana's elite, Georgia, Ohio State. Those are the 3 legit title contenders. But if Texas Tech or Oregon ends up winning it, nobody would be stunned. Those are elite teams. And then you've got Ole Miss and Texas A&M, which are both feisty one-loss SEC teams. Now, in terms of the 8 slot in that scenario, it's going to sound crazy, but in terms of just, who I think would have the best shot, I'd probably throw Texas in there. I think Texas has a much better chance to win it all than Oklahoma, Notre Dame, Miami, Alabama, BYU, Vanderbilt. But if we're going to do a 12-team playoff, obviously I already think Texas is the top 8 team. So Texas would be in. I would put, so that's 8. I would put Notre Dame. I would put, well, that's tough. So we got 3 more spots. So I put Notre Dame in. I would put Alabama in. So I got 2 more spots. I think I'd also put Vanderbilt in, and I'd throw Oklahoma in there. So, yeah, that'd be my top 12. So I'd leave out Miami. I'd leave out BYU. And so a lot of SEC, obviously.